Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Henry Schein Dental Academy webinar series. My name is Adam, marketing specialist, and I'll be your moderator. Eric Pook is our speaker today, and Eric will be discussing key steps to making a smooth transition, whether buying or selling a dental practice. Before we get started, we have a few reminders. At any point during the webinar, we encourage your participation. Please type any questions you have into the Q&A section of your control panel, and we'll answer them live at the end of the presentation. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand. And this webinar is sponsored by Henry Schein's Dental Business Institute as well as Cirrus Consulting. Eric, I am hoping you have the answer to the $100,000 question.
Thank you, Mr. Sweet. It is a pleasure. Welcome and good afternoon, good morning for those on the far West Coast. And appreciate everyone's time. I was just joking with Adam, it's been a humbling experience over the past 12 months since we started doing some of these. And it's amazing to see how far we've come. So now it's really about how do we go from surviving to thriving, and really a lot of the peak questions that we've been getting of the thousands of doctors that have reached out to us over the past few months is really now about what's next. And there's the glass half full looking to see, hey, you know what, now could be an amazing time to help increase and grow the size of the group if it's a multi-site, or for the doctors that see the opportunity, might be a good opportunity to relocate, right? Or certainly from those looking to build and expand and add that secondary satellite location, looking to buy. And obviously a lot on part two, a lot of registrants tonight are also coming from the perspective of, okay, great. I'm thinking of selling at some point in the next 1, 2, 5, 10 years. What do I need to do now to get myself prepared for that? And certainly the lease is one of the major components. So really appreciate everyone's time. Looks like we've got a record-breaking registration and attendance so far. So looking forward to jumping through. First of all, with our webinars, right, we're live, great opportunity to ask some key questions. So I would encourage you to use the Q&A function. I've now got a full vertical to see all attendees as well as all the Q&A questions, which is great. And then also, we'll pull up a poll here in one moment. And this is to help customize some of the content tonight. So based on the room, we pulled up some individual real estate reports, etc. But just to get a quick sense of the rooms to customize some of the plan and conversations this evening, if you could share a little bit about your current situation. Again, if you're driving, don't Zoom poll and drive. In the meantime, are you planning on opening or relocating a practice, planning to acquire the practice, planning to sell and transition the practice within the next 5 years, or planning to stay put, renegotiate the lease and weather out the storm, or none of the above? And then again, the goal for tonight's webinar, is it some general knowledge, right? Are you looking to get prepared for that eventual transition and looking to assemble your professional team now, right? And is there a current situation or urgency with the lease? For those of you that have a lease in place today, when does that expire? Are you month to month? Right? A lot of doctors these days think, hey, Eric, it's great. I'm month to month. I can sell. I have no responsibilities. It's the best of both worlds. But that could also be a major risk, considering, right, that the landlord tomorrow could come back and put a brown envelope on your door. So updates when your current lease is due to expire. Do you plan to buy or to buy a new practice? Right? And are you interested in getting more information about what your rental rates are for your specific location, or to have your lease professionally reviewed, which we'll discuss shortly based on a complimentary service for those who are attending tonight. Perfect. So we'll give that another quick second. In the meantime, tonight's content, ladies and gentlemen, is one of the most sought after. We've done a few of these events with Dr. Tom Schneider talking about transitioning and the importance of the lease as it pertains to transitioning. And this is about the dental practice buyer's and seller's guide, how to avoid making the $100,000 mistakes due to the dental office lease. And that can come from a variety of different ways. And unfortunately, there's been some really terrible examples recently where landlords have, upon the sale or request to sale, have caused significant red flags and concerns as a result. So the goal tonight is, how do we help to protect ourselves from that? And as a buyer, how do we help to leverage that situation of going in with that bag of money to help protect ourselves through the process? All right, so let's jump in, shall we? So Let's start this off. 85, 54, and 80. What the heck does that mean? Well, and these are, some of these have been updated post-COVID, but 85% of dentists have leases that can prevent them from selling their practice. For those of you following along and looking through a digital copy, we're going to go through a number of the clauses. So if you happen to be watching through on your laptop or otherwise, and you want to pull or view the digital copy of your lease, or if you've got it beside you, right, in the old drawer, etc., we'll cover some of those key clauses as well to follow along. In addition, and I would argue this is even higher, that 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent today for their practice. Based on some of the real estate reports we've pulled, based on the registrants tonight, we've pulled specific market rates as a result from across the country. And this one is, I've heard of two of these now in the past 48 hours. 80% of landlords structure their lease to give them the right to at least a 50% of their proceeds when the practice is sold. This is found in the consideration language within the lease, which we'll touch on and go through tonight as well. All right, we have a ton of great content, so let's fly right in, and all new content as well. So first off, we're going to give you some updated Q1 market trends analysis from coast to coast, from Anchorage to Honolulu to Key West to Bar Harbor and everything in between. We'll talk about the importance of the lease. The goal is not to make everyone here a leasing expert within the next 55 minutes. However, the goal is to help understand the importance, understand a couple of the key things to look for, and helping to make sure that you are giving yourself enough time to properly prepare you for what might be one of the largest financial transactions of your life, the eventual sale or purchase of the practice. Buyers, again, for those of you on the line, will look forward to how and what do you do throughout the process of looking and evaluating through due diligence to review and analyze the lease, and to make sure that you're not taking on the sins from the seller in terms of a poorly negotiated lease, or paying higher than market price, or having all sorts of additional guarantees, personal or joint and severally liable with your spouses, etc. Sellers, similar but different, right? Priorities are different. You're now focused on, how do I make sure I've got a smooth transition to avoid having personal or continual liability post-sale? How do I help to make sure that it's structured so that the landlord can't at the 11th hour throw a roadblock in front of the practice sale? And most importantly, how do I help to put a protective force field around those eventual practice sale proceeds by making sure there's not clauses in there, such as demolitions or relocations or otherwise, that from a buyer perspective might be a major red flag and cause them to look elsewhere. And then we'll look through some of those potential traps, depending on each of your situations. Those of you that haven't heard of us before, we are the only healthcare specialized tenant representation firm of our kind in North America. We've been a proud partner of Henry Schein's now for almost a decade. We were founded uniquely by a group of dentists for dentists that partnered with some real estate professionals to help ensure that the doctor was protected. As so many doctors were graduating through dental school, were so excited to get going and opening a new practice or buying a new practice, right? They would sign in a binding agreement on the trunk of a broker's car without truly understanding the importance of that dental office lease. So our firm's unique. We've done over 12,000 successful leases. We've got in-house legal, leasing, and consulting departments, do lots of continuing education courses, lots of work with Schein and Booth, do a lot of these major specific events throughout the US, and very proud to share that we have over 205 client reviews and have now achieved a perfect 5.0. So appreciate all of the clients that are on tonight that we may be doing their next lease negotiation for. All right, so let's jump into some of the facts. Number one, market insights and recent news. So it is a massive opportunity right now. Developers, major institutional investors are, again, looking to make significant amount of purchases. $11.2 billion worth of medical buildings were purchased in 2020 alone. Why? Because, right, dentists yourselves are the best tenants on the planet. I believe, based on the highest build-out costs, $150 to $200 per square foot, right? Which if you're buying or you're building, you're paying for it one way or the other. In addition to that, the lowest default rates, typically dental is less and far less than 1%. in comparison to restaurants or otherwise, which is almost the complete opposite. And now, even through the impact of COVID-19, you're finding that the dentist can never work from home and still brings in high quality foot traffic when other tenants are shuttered, and some throughout the continent are still in stay-at-home orders today. So from that perspective, very important that we really leverage how much leverage you have. In addition to that, Kane Anderson Real Estate is closing a $2.5 billion fund just to devote specifically to medical offices. So a lot of the smart money is coming in knowing how secure a medical dental type building is. So therefore, right, if it's beneficial for them, are you getting the leverage and getting the best results as well? From that perspective, we've made heavy investments this year to dramatically increase the quantity of data we have available to us. So basically, if you're concerned about what rental rates are, vacancy rates are, what the specific impact or what things may be trending towards or forecasted rates for your area, demographics, even some title search information, and in some cases, even what other tenants may be paying in certain markets. We have an incredibly high amount of data that we use throughout all of the continent. A couple of key components, obviously, we'll be sharing some of the forecasting. Obviously, right now, there's no crystal ball, but it's interesting to see what some of the analytics and software are showing may happen in the future. So let's start with the market update. And again, for those of you that just recently joined, we now have all of the Q&A section open. So feel free as we go, happy to answer some questions if it's relevant to the topic, or else we'll give some time at the end. Feel free to post some questions through Q&A and I'll get to them as quick as I can. All right, so a couple of components. National market growth rate year over year. So what the heck is that? Well, it's interesting, right? If you're looking at your lease right now and looking at it on another screen or flipping through it on your phone, look at what the annual increase is. Right? Is it 1%? Is it tied to CPI? Is it's hard tied to inflation? Dukes? Is it, what is it tied to? Or is it just 3 or 4% every single year? Right? What's interesting is that nationally, that market rent growth, right, year over year has fluctuated pretty dramatically. And especially through 2020 and estimated through 2021, it's going to be on that downward trajectory before, right, we get that back to hockey stick back up in the other direction as the economy comes rearing back. National availability rate. This is also interesting. We're looking at the total availability of spaces and opportunities throughout the market. And national leasing activity is interesting as well. So interestingly, that 2020 had a massive hit, of course, on the whole commercial real estate market. And 2021 rather, is not off to a great start. What does that mean for you? Well, if you've driven past more than 5 for lease signs on your drive to and from the office, chances are might be a great time with a lot more leverage to be negotiating or renegotiating that lease with the landlord. So let's jump into some aggregates and then specifics. So looking through, what we're looking at here in blue is the market rates, which as you can see have increased pretty dramatically through 2019, right? And then peaked and then started to decline through 2020 and declining now into 2021. Number 2 is vacancy rates. In orange here, you can see that that's increasing 10, 12, 14, 18, 20, 20%. So we're seeing an increase in the availability of space. So from that perspective, right, again, when you're looking left, looking right in your strip mall or in your medical dental building or otherwise, if you're seeing some of those vacancy rates, there's a lot of mom and pop landlords out there that are struggling to make some of their mortgage payments. There's large institutional landlords that took massive hits because of the downside of retail and how many businesses have closed and aren't coming back as a result. So for many of the attendees tonight, we pulled these customized for you. So for those of you joining from Milpitas, California, I used to live in Southern California, not too far from Anaheim. Interestingly, vacancy rates really took a hit through the impact of COVID. Market rates as well, consistently on the upward trajectory, but the vacancy really increased. So your takeaway there is, again, if you're looking to buy or build from that perspective, there is other competition. So some of the space that you might I never thought I'd get that beautiful sort of coffee shop, natural light, end cap, corner type of unit. Right? There may be some availability now. even though it was in someone's family for decades. Anaheim, similar but different, right? Through some of the impacts. In their case, vacancies obviously went up through 2021, but interestingly, a significant decline in market rents as a lot of some of the industrial and other components shifted the focus. Orlando, right? Orlando, interestingly, right? Significant vacancy increases, yet, right? Marginal increase in flattening on market rent. For those in Boca, I was talking to a doctor last week looking to relocate. His wife is all excited to stay. She's down there now. She wants to stay. She doesn't want to leave. So interestingly, right here, massive increase in vacancy rates. Very sheer incline, right? Market rates starting to level off. And two others, San Antonio as an example, Washington as another example, right? Vacancies increasing, rental rates fluctuating. So if you're curious about your particular space, your particular market, we can pull these type of business and building analysis reports. So this can look at availability reports. This can look at some basic demographics. It can look at some zoning information. Can look at some of the other major tenant and anchor tenants. But in the right-hand side, again, it's very small, so not to dig into it, but we can certainly see now what is going on in the subject property, what's vacancies doing. More so in the submarket, right? How much is the submarket down? What are market prices doing in that market? And in this case, year over year was down 39.9%. I just had my eyes checked, so I can see that now. Maybe that's 34.6. But as a perspective, right, it now means in this particular market that it'll take 13.3 months. So if you were to leave, or a commercial tenant were to leave, and vacate the premises, on average to fill that space, it's over 13.3 months, over 1.3 months of just sitting vacant. So if you were to leave or relocate or otherwise, that has a major financial hit to the landlord. And that's the risk that they would take with any of their properties being vacated. Okay, again, looks like a whole surge of people joined as they were wrapping up today. Hopefully everyone had a great productive day. We certainly really appreciate your time. So now let's get into understanding the importance of the agreement during the purchase and acquisition and sale of the practice. So again, the Q&A is open. Looks like some additional questions are coming through. Feel free to just add them as you go, and we'll try to cover them as we move through. So one of the core fundamentals of tonight is the lease and preparing for sale. So these are what I will say is some of the main components when looking forward to transition planning. I'm sure, like many spouses out there, you had a few nudges to the rib. Honey, I think COVID is finally the opportunity, right, to hang up the coat and potentially to retire and transition. Right? And that's a very difficult decision. For some of you, had a taste of that when we were all shuttered in place last year and said, I'm not ready to retire. I am not ready to slow down yet. So a couple of components. First and foremost, again, for those of you following along with your leases, the assignment section. The assignment section is critical. Most practice sale agreements will typically be conditional to A, the structuring of financing, right, and being approved for financing, or number two is specifically focused on the lease and the ability that the assurance that the lease will be assigned from the seller, the vendor, to the buyer, right, from the assignor to the assignee. That assignment, many doctors unfortunately find out at the 11th hour. They realize that, hey, I cannot sell my practice without the written confirmation and approval by the landlord. So the assignment section is critical. We'll spend some more time in going through actually some practical examples of that as well. Number two is rental rate increases, and more so rental rates. What does your rent compare to others in the market? Right? How much of your expenditures is going towards tenancy expense? National average show about 8.32% of a tenant's revenue is going to tenancy expense, base rent, and taxes, maintenance, insurance, etc. How much are you paying to the landlord? So as you're doing your quick math, hey, I'm paying $100,000 a year. right? And my production is 1.4%. You can quickly do the calculation to say, hey, you know what? I'm a little off of the national average, right? What are some key things I can focus on? Is it a production problem or is it a rent problem? A lot of things that some doctors do, speaking of production, are sell too late. So what do I mean by that? A lot of doctors will just wind down, right? Enjoy the quality of life, golf a little more, right? Taking the foot off the gas a little bit, go from 5 days to 4 days to 3 days. But unfortunately, the maximum value of the practice would have been right on the peak. So if you're contemplating starting to slow down, it may be worth its while to start investigating what it would look like to sell to any wide variety of potential buyers. In addition to that, consideration. So within, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've heard of 2 recent examples of doctors that landlord held them hostage and wanted payments north of $100,000 purely in allowance and for the benefit of the landlord to grab the pen, right, put it from one side of the desk to the other and sign the assignment to allow the practice to be sold. That is, in my opinion, gut-wrenching. That after all those years of hard work and hard service, that suddenly now the seller now has to take a hit. And one recently that I spoke to, it was over $140,000. That upon close, right, they simply reduced, right, and this one sold to a DSO, they were forced to take that hit directly off the chin at the 11th hour before closing. What else were they going to do? Right? So the seller really got themselves into a rock and a hard place. So it's a perfect opportunity to remind ourselves the importance of negotiating the lease early and properly. Number 4, surrendering the premises. So a lot of you that may have said, you know what, I am done. COVID has pushed me over the limit. I'm going to grab the keys, right, and throw it into the Pacific Ocean. Some of you may have found out that it's just not that easy. And that some of you, if you were to walk away or to sell just your charts, that in many cases, in the language, in the alteration section or restoration section of the lease, there's a requirement for you to return it back to pre-dental condition, or basically removing any of the leasehold improvements that you may have added, or potentially, if you bought the practice, potentially what the buyer would have added. So from that perspective, we certainly want to make sure that we're protecting ourselves and aware if you might be hit with a $10,000 or $15,000 demolition clause or a requirement to remove it or demolish the space internally, which could be 10 or 15,000. Number 5, a great reminder for especially buyers is to have a death and disability clause inserted into your lease. The death and disability clause is dental specific language to add to your lease to ensure that let it be a buyer or a seller, right? But especially the buyer, that heaven forbid, if something were to happen to you or your ability to practice wet finger dentistry, right? Yourself or your estate has the ability to either A, terminate the lease with a 3, 4, even 6 months notice, or specifically being able to again, terminate the lease or potentially not be held in default to allow your estate to be able to renew the lease in preparation for sale. Right? Term is very important. For those of you that haven't gone too deeply into the buying and selling process, you'll find that many of the major lenders will not issue a loan unless there's sufficient term on the lease. Meaning, if there's only 3 years left on the lease, right, the lenders and the underwriters won't give a 10-year or even a 5-year term to the doctor because, right, I'm sure they've been burned too many times in the past. They give a big loan, the doctor moves in, and after a short period of time, they're out on their ear, right, with their chair underneath their arm, and now struggling to figure out what's next and having to come back, right, looking for more money to build out a practice, down the hall or down the street. Personal guarantees. This is an important one. And we had a lot of questions and a lot of doctors surprised that this was even in their lease, especially through the pandemic. Everyone laid off their staff. Suddenly, the number one hit to overhead became the tenancy expense. So last year was the biggest year in our 27-year history, helping clients from coast to coast. So again, we are exclusively a healthcare specialized tenant rep firm, but personal guarantees is one I usually get the most questions about, meaning that if there's any damages or disputes, Depending on your language of the personal guarantee, or if you've signed it personally, right, that means that if in the event of a dispute, the landlord could have the opportunity to leapfrog over your corporation, right, and recoup missing rent or damages from you personally. So, from that perspective, be aware of what's within your lease. And in some cases, the landlord might have even gone even further to ask for your spouse. Or one recently I saw in California, they asked their family member, right, to actually be a personal guarantor. So a lot of risk, especially looking at the impact of COVID or otherwise, right? There's a lot of risk and exposure for that. And some of you that may be looking to sell and have a personal guarantee, that may even survive after your sale, right? Through the continuing liability clause, which we'll touch on as well. Okay, so that's a lot. We're going to break some of these down one by one together. Again, see some good questions coming up. Let's talk about some of these rent to buy scenarios and agreement. Let me come back to that one. And again, feel free to add to the Q&A. It looks like a whole surge of people recently joined as well. All right, so let's get into the good stuff. The 7 main financial negotiables. So unfortunately, a lot of doctors, when they assess a practice to buy or they renegotiate with their landlord, they look at the lease as a static item, or they just focus on the first half of the first page. What's the term? Right? Who's the tenant? Who's guaranteeing it? Right? And in addition, what's the base rent? And maybe what's the annual increase? But unfortunately, there's another 65 pages or 95 pages of other stuff in there that the landlord or their attorneys have spent a lot of time and energy putting together. So the whole concept of tonight is to help ensure that if you agree that there's a significant amount of components here, a significant amount of concern based on specifically your situation, you want to look at all of the main financial variables. Think about them as sort of valves on the wall, right? You want to turn up one, maybe to turn down the other, and each landlord looks at each of these a little differently. But you want to look at what your long-term goals are, 5, 10, 15 years, and to help minimize your long-term expenditure, maximize your benefit. So there's base rent that goes without saying. I would strongly suggest, if you haven't already, looks like we've got a bunch of emails, send us through the information or the address, as well as any additional information about the lease, and we'll pull up to make sure you're getting a fair market rent. We can pull up the updated post-COVID. We can pull up some of the rates and vacancies to make sure, am I actually paying fair market rent or not? Number 2, annual increases. So interestingly, the impact of the pandemic has caused the old lease negotiating handbook to go out the window. What's been interesting is a lot of landlords are open to the fact of saying, you know what, it's COVID. I don't know what the 3rd wave or 4th wave or God knows. I don't want to commit to these increases over the next few years. Some landlords are open to making sure that that's a flat rate for 1, 2, 3, maybe an adjustment, 4, 5, 6 at another rate, basically starting to iron out what those annual increases are instead of just a 3 or 4% every single year like clockwork. Number 3, common area maintenance is a big one. A lot of doctors see upwards of a third of their rent expense, their tenancy expense, going towards CAM, taxes, maintenance, and insurance. And especially in downtimes, the landlord might have incurred additional costs or had a tough time financially, and maybe they're getting a little creative in terms of the extra cost they might be passing on to their tenants. So the questions there is, do you have audit rights, right? Does your professional team have the ability to review the source documents to ensure that they're charging you fairly? If they're not, is there any recourse payment to you if they've been overbilling you incorrectly? In addition to that, is there any CAM cap? Some landlords will agree to fixing how much they can increase year over year. Bottom line, it's a big expense. There's some great blog posts written on our website, cirrusconsultinggroup.com. It talks about what is reasonable and unreasonable. Why should you be incurring and paying for the landlord's fees just because there's other vacancies? Why should you be paying commissions or legal fees or otherwise for something that doesn't benefit you at all? Fixturing is another one. So for those of you that might be thinking about expanding or buying a practice and maybe relocating it and building it out, fixturing is a big component, which is the period of typically from possession to commencement. So from the time you get the keys to the time that you're open, that's the time that you're literally fixing up the practice. Some landlords, 1, 2, 3, 4, or more months worth of basically not free rent, but not being charged for base rent. You're typically charged for common area maintenance, but fixturing is a big one. Free rent, though, is after possession, right? And if you're signing, especially those of you contemplating signing a 10-year term, right, there is lots of leverage there. And for you, giving that landlord basically what could be a multi-million-dollar check with a 10 or 15 or 20-year commitment, right? Free rent is a reasonable request, especially to help out with some cash flow in the short term. Tenant improvement allowance. So this, again, not a big one through the process of purchase and sale, but you want to be cautious. Think of it as a bit of fool's gold. It can be great, right? It's nice. It seems, hey, the landlord's going to give me money to fix up the space. But don't forget, they're not in the lending business, and it's certainly not free. So unfortunately, one way or another, you're paying for that. So the question would be, is in lieu of tenant improvement allowance, how much could you potentially reduce in rent or otherwise? Number 7, landlord work is a big one, which is what issues are there in the space? Is there leaky faucets? What's potentially wrong in the space today? If you're not sure about these things in your lease, right, definitely important that you have that reviewed. We talked about some of the financials. In the essence of time, I want to get to some of the practical answers and get to some of your questions. But this is a pretty eye-opening experience. I just took a simple $5,000 a month rent example with 3% annual increases. And, it's pretty interesting to see that, what a great business it is to be a landlord. Right? You're there, hey, no problems at all. It's, $3 a square foot here in California, or it's, $10 a square, $30 a square foot per year, or $50 per square foot a year in New York, whatever, right? But that's it, right? Low monthly payment. They call it the reducing the ridiculous, right? Just a small, price per square foot. But when you start to add it up and get the calculators out, and you can literally take your annual rent payment multiplied by 1.03, if that's your annual increase, and just equals, and this is what you'd see. Right? It goes from $60,000 all the way up to $78,000 over the first 10 years. And then who knows? What are your options to renew look like? Does it state that it can never be less than what you paid on the exit? Did you negotiate what the rates should be at year 11 when you negotiated your original lease? If not, right, many doctors now in some markets are paying more, or the landlord's trying to charge them more in exchange. So let's say they increase the rent to $85,000, right? And that suddenly goes from roughly $700,000 a year to almost $1 million a year, 1.6 million over the first 20 years. And again, for those of you typically, right, are in the same location for over 20 years, right? Looking at even that third decade of over 1.2 million. So from that perspective, cumulatively, almost $3 million of expenditure. So as you're looking to buy, as you're looking to sell, right, how important is this? Obviously, the buyers, this is paramount. This is your future here. The sellers, hey, what's a couple extra more bucks per square foot? You're on your way out, right? I get it. But look at it through the eyes of the buyer. And there's always an opportunity or an ability to help to ensure that, especially if there's no term from the seller today, or there's only 2 years left. That new landlord, I'm sure, would love to see a proposal for a new commitment rather than just 2 years on the lease. Many landlords might be open to a 5 or a new 10-year term, or creating something from scratch using their new standard form lease versus the one that might have been signed by the seller from 1983. Okay, so this is what I promised. This is sort of part 2 here. So from that, we're right on for time. Again, for those of you that recently joined, Q&A sections here, and this is a good section. So let's take a quick minute now to read through this. This is the assignment clause found in about 75% of dental office leases. For those of you driving, I won't read it out loud, but I'll certainly highlight some of the concerns. Take a quick minute to read this and see if you can see any potential issues. this time in my in-person seminars, I usually say, and who loves reading leases? Well, I have the pleasure of doing that daily with my team and attorneys on staff and real estate experts and consultants. So it's a bit of a labor of love, especially when you know what you're looking for. So let me make it a little easier for us. So first off, right here, if you notice this right in the first sentence, it states that if the tenant should wish to assign or sublet the lease premises, it shall have first received the consent of the landlord. Period, full stop. So hopefully it's not new news to you, but you will be unable to sell your practice without the agreement and consent of the landlord. Now, it also may say that the landlord may be able to, or if it's silent, may say that the landlord can arbitrarily withhold, delay, or even condition the sale, meaning they could change the terms, they could just simply withhold consent, or in some cases, as we'll see in a second, even worse. So at any request for such consent shall be in writing within 15 days following the receipt by the landlord of such request for consent, meaning you've got a buyer, you've got a practice broker, everything's done. You're just about to sell. You reach out to the landlord and say, good news, I'm out. Have a nice day. And the landlord says, hang on a second. Right? I'm going to review the application, and then I'm going to choose one of 3 envelopes. One envelope says, yes, approved. Congratulations. You can sell, right? And the buyer is assigned the lease or sublet the premises. The second envelope, right, is, opening it up, declined. The landlord does not agree, and therefore you are unable to sell the premises or transfer the lease and sell your practice to that new tenant, that buyer. Or the third envelope, number 3, the landlord can terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment or sublet. Basically, the time that you're planning, the date of closure that you sent to the landlord to allow for change, the landlord can now say, good news, your lease is done. You want to be out? No problems. I'm terminating your lease effective on your closing date. And what would they do next? Right? Any for-profit landlord has all the information from the buyer. They could go directly to the buyer and say, how much more are you willing to pay, right, to take over the space? That is definitely something to look very carefully in your lease, let alone if you're buying or selling. If the landlord has that ability to terminate the lease now, even if you're a buyer, that's a red flag, because when you go to sell, the landlord has that hanging over your head. All right, for the next one. Again, questions as you come through, I see a few pop up. Feel free to throw through in the Q&A. Next one, landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term for the greater than the current market rate for the lease premises, not defined, or 15% greater than the then current rent. So let me get this straight. If the landlord allows the consent to go forward, the landlord has the right to say, great, you know what? I feel that you've been underpaying in rent, Dr. Smith. So now that you're selling, good news, I'm glad your buyer is. And now I'm going to be increasing your rent by 15% or more. For the buyers on the line, would you stick around if at the 11th hour, the landlord jumped the rent by 30%? Looking through, we should pull up another poll, right? I will bet there'd be a ton of no's. I would not move forward with the acquisition if the landlord is playing these games at the 11th hour. In addition, right, this is the consideration language we mentioned at the beginning. This is what I've heard of 2 recent examples where landlords specifically aligned with the assignment of the lease were requesting. One was a request for $140,000 when the doctor was selling his practice to a DSO. And as a condition of sale, the landlord required a check for that amount just to assign the lease. They didn't want to assign the lease. And the doctor had no other ability to sell the practice and move on and facilitate the sale. because of that lease. And it cost him $140,000 on the nose as an adjustment on closing, and that hurt hard. In addition, another example from a practice broker I was speaking to, right? The landlord wanted a check for over $100,000, about $120,000. They ended up getting that down to 65. But more importantly, imagine that at the end of your career, at the 11th hour, after the deal's about to close, right? Imagine what you would do. And in some cases, you don't hear these examples because the doctor's embarrassed. They're about to sell. They're on the 11th hour, and suddenly now, rather than it all falling apart, there are already visions of golfing and retirement, right? What do they do at the 11th hour? Well, hey, you know what? Instead of selling it for $1 million, oh, well, I guess 900 is good enough. Right? All the planning, all the practice, all the blood, sweat, and tears, and you let something as silly as a bunch of black and white on a piece of paper you signed a couple of decades ago have such a major impact to your practice sale. Don't let that happen to you. And then from that perspective, last but not least, you got to look out for those notwithstanding clauses. Notwithstanding the landlord's consent to any assignment or subletting, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under this lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. So, as you can imagine, this is the continuing liability clause. And I can almost, if we were asking for a show of hands here, and for those of you following along, I will bet that at least 3/4 of you have this clause in your lease today, buyers or sellers. So what does that mean? That means that even after you sell, you are still on the hook for this lease. So there was an example of a doctor who was in Michigan, sold his practice, moved to Florida, got a phone call a few years later. It was the landlord. Unfortunately, the buyer had defaulted on the lease and was gone. Right? That doctor was shocked to find out that he was personally guaranteed and was still on the hook, right? Based on this type of language through continuing liability, that even post-sale, he was responsible for not only the back rent, but the remaining 3.5 years of term left on the lease. Can you imagine being stuck in that situation, enjoying the first few years of retirement, and then suddenly getting this phone call and reaching out to the office manager to see how we can get the band back together? Did you let your license lapse, right? Where do you sit? Bottom line is, be aware of this. This is as if you're co-signing a car for your neighbor's teenage kid and then moving out of state. Right? You have no control, you have no visibility on it. And from that perspective, right, it's just dust in the taillights. But if anything happens to that, that's still just as much of the responsibility as if you were driving that car as well. Right? So be very cautious about the assignment language. So interestingly, here's one clause, and this whole thing should be rewritten. Okay, I see a few more questions come through. We'll get to those shortly. So what's the cost of this mistake? Well, back to the title, having to relocate unexpectedly, especially at the end of the term, or having to absorb a significant amount of rent at the end of the term, or potentially reduce your price of the practice because of it, or worse, the inability to sell. I mean, insert your potential value here, but that could be hundreds, $2 to $500,000 worth of value, right? Therefore, the lease can impact 100% of your eventual practice sale proceeds. Okay, so here's another one. Let's take another quick second. Don't worry, this is the last big one. Option to renew. This is found in 90% of leases. So have a quick second to look through this and to see if you can find some of the potential red flags. I see some other questions about transitions where the vendor is becoming the landlord or is the landlord. So we'll touch on that. That can be a good thing, or that can be a major red flag, meaning that the dentist knows the space, knows the value, yet has an emotional attachment to that fluorescent green color there, or the layout, or if you were to ever relocate, That landlord may have a significant issue if you want to take a lot of the components that are affixed to the space. So finding out what actually is yours and what the landlord will deem is affixed or property owned by the landlord. So we'll touch on that when we get to Q&A. Okay, what did we find first? Hopefully, right in the first sentence, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as a tenant, meaning that if, right, Dr. Joe Black is not the tenant and that lease is transferred to someone else, right, that option is non-transferable. So you want to be aware to find out if you only have 2 years left on the lease or 3 years or 4 years left on the lease and 1 or 2 5-year options, you might think, heck, I got lots of time. However, if the options are personal to the seller, they're no good to you as a buyer, or there's no good to you as a seller either, because now the new doctor is going to struggle to get financing considering there's only 4 years left on the lease. So making sure that the options, right, good for you, not as great for the landlord, are beneficial and that they can be transferable to the buyer. All right, number 2, did you find this one? If the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and has performed its covenants and obligations under this lease and has not been in default, that's a big one. So here's what's happened over the past years. And again, if this has happened to you, then we should definitely regroup afterwards. Number 1 is with the impact of shelter in place and the shutdowns, many doctors brought in contractors. They might have cordoned off an operatory. They might have impacted the airflow, right, to help to segment some of the open bays, or they may have made some specific alterations to the space. Note in your alteration section, it may be clear that you are unable to make any changes without the landlord's prior written consent. So if you did bring a contractor in, if you did impact the airflow, that may have unintended consequences. That might cause issues with fire codes or otherwise. That's why it's in there. That's why the landlord wants to be aware of any changes you made. But if you've made them, right, and didn't get their approval, then obviously now the landlord has some recourse to hold you in default, and these options then become null and void. And unfortunately, depending on your lease, they might not even have to tell you. So that's number 1. Number 2 is from that perspective, it could be other components. Ask yourself the question, did you ask for help of a rent deferral or rent abatement this time last year? If so, did the landlord, were they shrewd and asked the right question to say, okay, doctor, you want some help? No problems, right? I've just got 100 requests for free rent and help. Did they ask for your financials? A lot of doctors last year, unfortunately, got into the situations that the landlord asked for their financials. The doctor said, whoa. I don't want you to see my last 2 years of tax returns. I had some pretty good years, right? So, you know what? Don't worry about it. I'll just keep paying rent. And they went away. But unfortunately, if within your lease, it stated very clearly that it was your responsibility and you signed off that within 10 business days, regardless of the reason why, you must, right, surrender your financial reports and banking statements, and you did not, then that also could be a reason for default. That if the landlord or their agents or otherwise are looking for a reason to make life difficult or to get you out or bring another tenant in, etc., these are the type of loopholes you really want to be aware of and help make sure that you're not in default. Other examples were, again, if you didn't make your rent payments and you just deferred and the broker said, you know what, pay me down the line, right? Or pay me when you can, but it wasn't properly amended. Well, that's you that haven't now done what you had signed off on. Also, if you received a default notice through, right, March of last year, as COVID was all ramping up, well, there was one in a mall that literally, as the whole state was shut down, that doctor got a default notice that said, look, per your lease, you must be open from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Saturday, right? And regardless of the global pandemic, right, we find you in default. Disgusting. Any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. That's another one that's hidden in there. One sentence, but that basically gives the landlord the opportunity that when you renew your lease, good news, here's a whole new set of paper. So regardless of how hard you worked, regardless of what you negotiated, right, it goes back to zero. This is another one. This is what I call the world's most boring roller coaster, that in no event shall it be less than the rent paid the last year of the original term. So again, it's going up and up and up. Or last but not least, based on the market rent for the renewing tenants in the building. So if they've been a bunch of new starts or new tenants that have moved in and they've given a bunch of tenant improvement allowance, and in exchange, the new tenants are paying 10 or 15% more in rent or 30% more in rent than you are, suddenly now, patang, that's you being hit with a much higher rental rate increase. So again, another clause in here, be very cautious, very aware, and go into this, let it be the purchase or the sale with your eyes wide open. What's the cost of the mistake? Well, inability to sell, having to absorb the significant increase in rent, being remained as a liable, right, post-sale, or even personally post-sale, right, and paying the landlord a portion of your percentage of practice sale proceeds. Unbelievable. Okay, from that, here's a recent example of a doctor that sent a letter that his landlord stated that said right here. So the two, I'll get to that in a second. As you know, your lease expires November 14th. Pursuant to your section 2.4, you had an option to renew the lease for 5 years at market rate. However, you were required to give me written notice of your intention to renew by not later than 6 months prior to the expiration of your current term, which you did not do. So this is, right, no later than May 14th, which you did not do. Please be advised that my broker will be placing, this is 3 or 4 days after you missed it, right? My broker will be placing a for lease sign in a conspicuous but non-intrusive place on the premises this week. So now all your patients, as they walk in, have a big for lease sign on your window. Right? If you're still interested, have your people call my people. Right? So doctors, please, as a takeaway here, right, take out your phone and put in 2 dates. Number 1, when is your option to renew deadline? And number 2, when does your lease expire? Don't miss those dates. Ideally, from a negotiation perspective, you want to have the full negotiation complete prior to the option to renew deadline date, which could be 6 or 12 months prior to the actual expiry. The landlords want to know if you're on your way out, they want to market it, and they want to minimize the months on market that it's sitting there empty. Okay, so let's summarize here. Buyers, what to look out for. So first of all, when you're doing your due diligence, ask for a copy of the lease. Very reasonable. Right? Let's see the lease. What's left for term? What's left for this? Don't just rely that, hey, there's a lease, or don't just rely on, what someone put together as a bit of a summary. Have it, get it, and have it professionally reviewed. This is now going to be yours shortly and your liability. And there are some doctors that just signed the assignment and never even saw the 70-page lease agreement. So, in the essence of time, at a high level, these are some of the core clauses to be looking at if you're coming in to buy. Is there exclusivity? Can the landlord put in another GP right next to your GP practice? Right? Is there, again, termination language? Is there continuous operation that we just discussed? Some brokers now will assess that if there's a demolition or relocation right, they will reduce the price of your practice by $250 per square foot. Right? And depending on when that relocation or demolition rate kicks in, that's how much less your practice is worth. There was a doctor recently that sold their practice, and because of that demolition clause, right, the valuation of their practice was reduced by over $250,000. Death and disability we touched on, surrender, potentially returning it back to pre-dental condition, overholding. That's important, right? For the seller, that's month to month, or for the buyer, and it's a month-to-month lease, right? You might, in your lease, the landlord may have the right that if you're not under term, they could potentially increase your rent by 150 or 200%. Lots of other clauses here to go through in the essence of time. Let's move on. Sellers, right? Equally, but still important, right? Are you in a month-to-month situation? How much more in rent as a penalty may you have to pay? Does the landlord have the right to go back to when you became a month-to-month tenant? I did a CDRA with a doctor recently as well in the South. Unfortunately, there was over 3 years of liability going back because they had been month to month for that long of a time. Assignment, right? Is there term? What is the assignment rights? Can the landlord terminate the lease just for asking to sell? Right? Do they have the right for financial statements? Is there a chance that you might be in default? Have you signed a personal guarantee? Right? What does the assignment section look like? All core components. In addition to that, practice acquisition guide. Right? So we have some great resources for those of you either looking to buy or for those of you looking to sell. We have some great information. You can email us. Our marketing associates are standing by. They can certainly send you this to give you a little bit of background. And for those of you that might have jumped in or jumped out or joined a little late, a lot of the information is right through some of these specific forms. All right, to summarize a few core components. For those of you thinking of selling in the next 5 to 10 years, remember this graph, the tenant lease cycle. Start your process early. Typically 2, maybe even 3 years prior to expiry is the best time to start engaging with the landlord to ensure that there's sufficient term and the lease is structured in a way to allow for a smooth transition. For those of you that just might be mid-career, right, typically 2.5 years is a great time to start again engaging the landlord. Don't fall into the trap. Many landlords will wait 6 months, 12 months, right? Or in some cases, 2 or 3 months before the lease expires, you missed your option to renew deadline, and the landlord says, oh, hey, if you want to stick around, no problems. Here's your new lease, right? Here's a 20% increase in rent. Congratulations. Don't fall into that trap. Right? 8 key steps to success. Number 1, if you don't have a digital copy of your lease today, get it. Email your landlord. Please, I'm updating my files. Please send me a digital copy of my lease for all, for my original lease, signed version, and make sure it's countersigned by the landlord. If you don't have something that's signed by the landlord, it's not worth the paper it's written on. Number 2, right? Identify your practice for career goals. What's next steps? What's your goals? Right? Number 3, have it professionally reviewed. Number 4, get all your specific market rates, rental rates, vacancies, etc. Number 5, right? What does that end goal look like? The negotiation should be a carefully choreographed game of chess. Now, interestingly, 1 through 5, what have we not done? And some of you are probably thinking about doing this right now. Oh, hey, my lease might be coming up. My lease is coming up soon. Eric told me to start early. I'm just going to call my landlord. Don't fall into that trap. Right? What are you going to say? Hey, Mr. Landlord, what are you thinking about charging me now in the future? Oh, yeah, I'll get back to you. You're the customer. Right? So our process here is to get all this done first and then have the strategy, have the end game, negotiate the business clauses, negotiate the financial clauses, and not stop till you get to a fully executed lease. In the essence of time, there's some fantastic examples of doctors through the purchase and sale that have used us, given us some fantastic 5-star reviews. Right? This was a personal client of mine. She tried to sell her practice 3 separate times. At 74 years of age, she was forced to relocate her practice just to facilitate the sale. The landlord was a piece of work. Therefore, right, we were able to find a new space, negotiate right from the letter of intent to get the landlord to cover all of the build-out costs through landlord work because the landlord was so anxious to secure that dental tenant. We were able to negotiate that lease and really save this doctor from a massive headache and prevented her from ever being able to sell the clinic. So as we wrap up here, we will pull up a poll to summarize a few components this evening, as well as some next steps. As an appreciation from everyone's time, we are offering critical dates and risk analysis. So for those on the buyer side, those on the seller side, or those that are just sitting there with a lease looking at them, I would strongly suggest to click yes. If it's an urgent situation, please note, I always spend a couple hours looping back with clients afterwards, after these webinars, to call or email. From that perspective, look, if it's your or potentially your target acquisition space, is it month to month? Is it up in the next 2 years? Right? How much leverage do you have? Or do you own? If you own, right, and you're looking to sell and you're an owner operator of the building, Very important that you've got a proper dental specific lease in place now. So when you go to sell, how smooth is it to say, look, hey, this is the lease I've had all year, for the past few years, I'll just assign that to you. Versus suddenly as one more big document to have all the lawyers do all the back and forth upon the sale. Right? And if the ink is still wet, right, on the lease you just created, it's just going to be another red flag for the buyer's, M&A attorneys and their team. So important you've got that lease set up as early as possible with dental specific language and clarity, right? What kind of lease do you want? So if you own your building, strongly suggest having a conversation there as well to talk about how and what that looks like. What if the doctor comes in and completely paints it, the walls blue, I don't know, purple, aquamarine, who knows, right? What if they want to relocate and they want to take all their gears? Are you okay with that? Right? Those are the type of things that you really want to be aware of if you are either own your own building and looking to sell, or if you're looking at moving into or potentially being a tenant of a doctor that's looking to maintain and keep that passive form of income. So we'll do a complimentary lease review. Again, in appreciation of everyone's time this evening. Okay, so as promised, we'll keep the lines open. I still see we've got a whole massive host of people through here. So again, the Q&A sections are open. Let's start to jump in some of the questions. So you can use the chat feature or the Q&A section. Number one, so when dealing with the transition with a practice owner that owns the building, what are the most important considerations? If the rent seems artificially high, how can I confirm this? Additionally, is there a rent to buy agreement? And that is the best way to structure the deal. So great questions. So first off, yes, be cautious. You're now about to pay a massive amount for the practice, but you've also now got this lease that you've still got this sort of odd relationship that now they're your landlord, and now they've got the ability to potentially come into your practice at any time. They might come back in to see the office staff. They might be back in to see some patients. And if they have that ability in the lease, you might be driving yourself crazy as the buyer. So let's look at it from the buyer's perspective. So yes, if you're now contemplating rent, first of all, get all the real estate reports. Definitely reach out for the rental rate analysis and or the lease review and find out what are available properties in the area going forward, what's comparable. And I can't strongly suggest enough, have a third party in place. Many clients use us to be that intermediary to help maintain the relationship, yet to come in, not as a 300-pound gorilla, but to have the quantifiable facts and to help make sure that we've got a win-win deal for you both. The last thing we want is the deal to go sour because now suddenly of the lease and now you're trying to get fair rent and you've just paid $1 million for the practice and now suddenly you want an extra 20% more in rent. Well, hang on a second. I just fought to get this price for the practice. Now you're just making it back in spades, right? In terms of the renewal. So that's a big one. In addition to that, so how would you confirm this? Reach out so we can get you the market rental rates. And number two, so a great component there is a ROFR. Not the new name for your puppy dog, but a ROFR is the right of first refusal. And that could be specifically for either the ability to expand into the adjacent suite or the potential to acquire the building. That might be at a specific date, it might be for a specific term, or it might just be the ability to match the future buyer's request. That's nice to have. So if the landlord goes to sell the building, they can't do it from underneath your nose. So at least you've got that right to purchase. And if nothing else, they've got to contractually alert you prior to the sale. So hopefully that answers your question to the first doctor, but definitely making sure that everything is structured right. Also look at, again, who owns what trade fixtures, are they defined? Do you own the chairs? Do you own the cabinetry? Could you move all the cabinetry with you if you wanted to move down the street in a few years? Those are the type of things to be aware of. Can you change the colors? Can you change the layout? Right? Those are the type of conversations to make sure contractually you've got your protection on. The last thing you want is suddenly to make some changes. The landlord then comes back and says, right, per your alterations sections, you didn't get my approval. And here's all the bad things that are going to happen now. Right? And now suddenly you're struggling. You've now paid the money for the practice, and now you're forced to move down the street. Okay, here's another good question. What do you suggest if your landlord is a national size landlord? Oh, I love these. And will not negotiate some of the terms that are prohibitive to you. So the first thing I would say is we've dealt with some of the nastiest, largest, biggest landlords, and everything is negotiable. Just depends on how much you want it and your strategy. So, I mean, part of the reason that we've got, 26, 27 years now of intellectual capital is that when the landlord says no, right, we now have the ability to have 6 or 7 other step downs to get them to agree to something that might not be as good as what we originally asked for, but is still dramatically better than what it was. So there's different step downs from that perspective. So with the national size landlords, in some cases, they're easier to deal with, right? Because you've got a large national team. And when our team gets involved, heck, some of our team have worked for the national landlords. So we hired those that used to negotiate against dentists and other tenants. So we've now hired them from the dark side to now represent in the David versus Goliath. So benefit from the 12,000 leases that we've done, and let's help to prioritize. Are they going to be open to all terms? No, of course not. But trust me, with the impact of the pandemic, right, I would be very surprised if their portfolio wasn't down and down dramatically year over year, especially in comparison to 2019. So therefore, now for yourself, right, what leverage do you have? And again, if you're about to sign a new, let's say, instead of just assigning the lease, of course, the landlord's not going to be that excited to completely rewrite the lease, but you've got to look at it from the landlord's perspective. You're about to buy a practice for $1 million, right, $500,000, whatever. Yet suddenly now, right, you want as much long-term predictability and continuity for that, right? The last thing you want to do is to have to pick up and leave unexpectedly. So from that perspective, as you're dealing with the national landlord, one of the best things you can do is to dangle the carrot, right? What would it look like now? One of the strategies are to look at a 5 or 10-year term, right? Dangle that big check and watch how much they move or adjust. Great question. A few questions here from the seller side. So one of the questions here, how and when do I deal with my landlord? So from a seller's perspective, some of the top brokers in the country will typically recommend about 9 years. Why 9 years? Because, right, if they've signed a 10-year lease, they want to start as early as possible, that before the term comes up, before the option to renew deadline, right, structuring that lease accordingly as early as possible, the better. It's far easier to get a lot of negotiation wins when you've got a bunch of runway than it is 2 or 3 years before you're looking to sell. Right? If the landlord has a whiff that you're thinking of selling and you're on their way out and you're about to renegotiate the lease for another 5 years, the landlord's going to say, well, hey, what's in it for me? Right? So it's about the ask. It's about how it's structured, and typically with a proactive process. So if you're in that situation, one of the things we love to do is to send out a proactive letter of intent, right? Or an offer, if you will. So here's what we would propose. Hey, I propose another 5-year term, 7-year term, maybe 10-year term, depending on your situation, right? And I want that to align the lease to the long-term value of the practice, right? The long-term benefit to align to your long-term career goals. Term and rent are key, right? And as you're renewing your lease, it's critical that you look at it through your buyer's eyes, right? Talking to a landlord yesterday about the use provision, or the doctor rather, about the use provision, right? Where, oh, I don't do endo, I don't do perio, I don't do ortho, I don't care. Well, that's fine, but what about the buyer? Suddenly, if the landlord brings in an orthodontist and gives them exclusivity over the subspecialty of oral dentistry, and suddenly now in your lease, it precludes you from doing any Invisalign or otherwise, you might not care. But I guarantee the associate that was planning on getting 20% of his or her revenue from Invisalign is really going to care, right? So it's these type of things that you want to go into your eyes wide open, start structuring things early, start maximizing your current situation and getting that leverage early. for both on the financial as well as through all the other clauses within the lease. Okay, I'll pause there, see if there's any additional questions. Perfect. Again, for those of you that didn't want to answer in the sort of the forum, certainly feel free to email us at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. I always am responsive to emails afterwards. So if you've got a nagging question, feel free. Also, my phone number was up there again at the beginning. Direct line is 647-789-3255. Or just email info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com with your number. Myself or one of the team will loop back with you ASAP. Or you can go to henryscheindental.com/Cirrus. We're a proud member of the practice services team and really appreciate everyone's time this evening. It's great that you're all here. It sounds like there's a lot of those coming in with that glass half full type of Rockefeller approach to really make some great opportunities to buy, expand, renovate, renew, or potentially sell their practice. Perfect. Great. Appreciate everyone's time. Mr. Sweet, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Eric, for the time today. Great content as always. Like Eric said, if anyone has additional questions about your dental lease or relocating your practice for that matter, because I handle that too, please email us at webinars@henryschein.com or info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, and Eric and his team will be happy to assist. Additionally, if anyone is interested in attending future Henry Schein webinars, visit henryscheindental.com/webinars for our upcoming schedule. This webinar was recorded, so everyone will receive the recording either later this week or early next week, so keep your eyes out for that. Thanks for joining us and see you back here soon.